What if the single most powerful piece of evidence about Hebrew identity in West Africa was not written by a black historian, not written by a civil rights activist, and not written by anyone with a reason to take your side? What if it was written by an Arab Muslim scholar in the year 1377, 700 years before this debate ever existed on the internet? And what if that scholar had absolutely zero reason to help your case? No political agenda, no community to protect, no ideological alliance with anyone in West Africa. He was Arab, he was Muslim, he was one of the most celebrated intellectuals in the entire Islamic world. And he still sat down, dipped his pen in ink, and wrote that the Hebrew tribes were living in West Africa. Not in the Middle East, not in Europe, in West Africa. Now here is the question that should stop you cold right now. If this information has existed in a published, academically recognized, and professionally translated text for over 600 years, why have you never once heard about it in a classroom, in a mainstream documentary, or in a history textbook? That question is what this entire video is about. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to understand why one man's 14th century manuscript changes everything we thought we knew about this conversation. And before we go any further, I want to hear from you right now. Do you believe that medieval Arab scholars had documented knowledge of West African civilizations? Drop your answer in the comments below, because what you are about to hear is going to challenge everything. Before we get into what was written, we need to understand who wrote it, because the credibility of any testimony depends entirely on the credibility of the person giving it. In a court of law, the most powerful witness is not someone who agrees with you. The most powerful witness is someone who had every reason to disagree with you and told the truth anyway. That witness, in this case, is Ibn Khaldun. Full name: Abd ar-Rahman ibn Muhammad ibn Khaldun al-Hadrami, born in Tunis, in what is now Tunisia, in the year 1332, died in Cairo in 1406. In between those two dates, he produced one of the most extraordinary works of intellectual history that the world has ever seen. The book is called al-Muqaddimah, which translates in English as the Introduction or the Prolegomena. It was completed in the year 1377, and it was not a casual journal or a personal memoir. It was a systematic, rigorous, encyclopedic analysis of human civilization, political power, social organization, and the patterns of historical change across multiple continents. Modern scholars, including Western scholars who have absolutely no interest in validating African history, have called al-Muqaddimah one of the greatest philosophical and social scientific works ever produced. The British historian Arnold Toynbee described it as undoubtedly the greatest work of its kind ever created by any mind in any time or place. That is a Western scholar saying that about an Arab Muslim intellectual who wrote it in the 14th century. So when Ibn Khaldun writes something in al-Muqaddimah, serious historians do not dismiss it. They take it seriously. Now here is why Ibn Khaldun is the most important witness in this entire conversation. And I want you to follow this logic carefully, because it is the foundation of everything else. First, he was Arab, not African. He had no ancestral connection to West African communities, no family loyalty, no tribal alliance. He was documenting from the outside. Second, he was Muslim. The Hebrew identity is connected to a religious and ethnic tradition that was, at various points in history, in direct theological competition with Islam. An Arab Muslim scholar in the 1300s had absolutely zero incentive to elevate the historical status of Hebrew tribes. Zero. Third, he had access to the greatest libraries in the medieval world. He worked in Tunis, in Morocco, in Granada, in Andalusian Spain, and eventually in Cairo. He consulted trade records, geographic accounts, oral testimonies from Saharan merchants, and earlier historical texts written in Arabic going back centuries before his own time. He was not speculating. He was compiling verified information from multiple independent sources. And fourth, and this is the point that matters most in any serious evidentiary argument, he is what lawyers call a hostile witness. A hostile witness is someone whose natural position is opposed to the claim being made, but whose testimony supports it anyway. When a hostile witness tells you something that runs against their own interests and their own worldview, that testimony carries the maximum possible weight in any rational evaluation. Ibn Khaldun had no reason to write what he wrote about Hebrew tribes in West Africa. No political pressure, no financial gain, no community loyalty. He wrote it because his sources, accumulated across decades of scholarship, told him it was true.
Now let us get specific, because this is where most people get vague, and vague does not hold up in any serious historical conversation. In al-Muqaddimah, written in 1377, Ibn Khaldun documents the populations and communities of what he calls the Sudan. And here I need to pause and explain that terminology because it is critical. In classical Arabic geographic literature, the word Sudan simply meant the land of the black peoples. It was a broad geographic designation referring to the region we would today call the West African Sahel and Sudan belt, stretching across Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, and surrounding territories. It was not a political term, it was a descriptive geographic one. Within his documentation of that region, Ibn Khaldun references communities that maintained Hebrew identity, practice, and lineage. He uses the Arabic term Banu Israel, which means the children of Israel or the sons of Israel, the same term used throughout classical Arabic religious and historical literature to refer to the Israelite people. He places these communities in the region connected to the Ghana Empire, which at its height controlled territory in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali, and which by the 14th century had fragmented but left behind a rich legacy of population settlements. He notes that these communities maintained distinctive religious observances that set them apart from the surrounding Muslim populations. They were not Muslim. They were not practicing traditional West African indigenous religion in the way their neighbors were. They maintained a separate and specific identity, with practices that Ibn Khaldun recognized as connected to the Israelite tradition. Now I want you to sit with that for a moment. An Arab Muslim scholar in 1377 is documenting a non-Muslim, non-pagan community in West Africa that he identifies with the Israelite lineage. He is not doing this to celebrate them. He is not doing this to make a political argument about African identity or Hebrew ancestry. He is doing it because he is a methodical historian, and this is what his accumulated sources showed him to be true. He also situates this within his broader analytical framework of history, which understood the dispersal of peoples across geography as a natural consequence of military conquest and political collapse. He applied this framework to the Israelites exactly as he applied it to every other civilization he studied: the Romans, the Persians, the Berbers, the Arabs themselves. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 CE and the subsequent expulsions were, in his historical model, not the end of the Hebrew people as a living population. They were the beginning of a great geographic dispersal that moved in multiple directions simultaneously. One of those directions, according to his sources, was south and west, through the Levant, across Egypt, along the North African coast, and into sub-Saharan West Africa. And here is a question I want to put directly to you. If Ibn Khaldun documented living Hebrew communities in West Africa in 1377, and the transatlantic slave trade began pulling massive numbers of West Africans onto ships within roughly a century of that writing, does that timeline concern you at all? Because it absolutely concerns me, and we are going to come back to it in detail.
Ibn Khaldun does not stand alone. And this point is critical, because a single source, no matter how credible, can always be dismissed as an outlier, a misreading, or an isolated error. One witness can be attacked, one document can be questioned, but when three independent Arab scholars, writing across 4 separate centuries, all document the same basic reality without any coordination or shared motive, you no longer have an outlier, you have a pattern. And patterns in historical analysis carry a fundamentally different level of evidentiary weight than isolated claims. Let me introduce you to the other 2 members of what I am calling the Arab triple confirmation. The first is Abu Ubaid al-Bagri, writing in the year 1068, more than 300 years before Ibn Khaldun. Al-Bagri was an Andalusian Arab geographer born in what is now Spain, and he produced a major geographic work called Kitab al-Masalik wa al-Mamalik, which translates as the Book of Routes and Realms. He had not personally traveled to West Africa, but he was an exceptional compiler of first-hand accounts gathered from Saharan merchants, Berber traders, and transcontinental travelers who crossed the desert routes on a regular basis. His geographic descriptions of West Africa in the 11th century are so detailed that modern historians use them to reconstruct the political organization and trade networks of the Ghana Empire. Within his documentation, al-Bagri describes communities along the Niger River and the Senegal River basin that maintained non-Muslim monotheistic practices, with traditions he connected to what Arabic literature called the people of the book, a classical designation covering Jewish and Hebrew identifying communities. He specifically notes that these communities had strict dietary restrictions, maintained specific days of rest and observance, and practiced circumcision as a religious covenant rather than simply a cultural custom. These are not vague surface similarities. These are specific covenant practices documented in the Hebrew scriptural tradition, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. Al-Bagri wrote this in 1068, no YouTube, no Black Hebrew movement, no modern political context whatsoever. The second figure is al-Makrizi, full name Taqi al-Din Ahmed ibn Ali al-Makrizi, born in Cairo in 1364 and died in 1442. He was one of the most prolific historians of the medieval Islamic world, producing exhaustive historical, geographic, and social accounts of Egypt and the surrounding regions. His major work, Kitab al-Mawa'iz wa al-Ettibar, remains a foundational text for scholars of medieval African and Middle Eastern history today. Writing in the early 1400s, al-Makrizi documents populations of Sudan and West Africa with specific reference to communities maintaining Israelite lineage and practice. But he adds a dimension that neither al-Bagri nor Ibn Khaldun emphasizes so strongly. He provides the historical mechanism. He connects the southward migration of Hebrew populations specifically to the period following the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the later dispersals under Byzantine Christian persecution. In other words, he explains how they got there. They fled across North Africa, generation by generation, settlement by settlement, over centuries of gradual southward movement until they were embedded within the broader population landscape of West Africa. So let us line this up clearly. Al-Bagri, 1068, Andalusian Arab, documents Hebrew practicing communities in West Africa. Ibn Khaldun, 1377, Tunisian Arab, documents Banu Israel in West Africa with specific geographic locations and cultural descriptions. Al-Makrizi, early 1400s, Egyptian Arab, documents the historical migration that explains their presence there. 3 scholars, 3 different countries of origin, 3 separate centuries, 0 coordination between them, 0 modern political motive, all pointing to the same conclusion. I want to ask the historians watching this a direct question. If 3 independent Arab scholars documented Hebrew communities in West Africa across 4 centuries, what level of evidence would be required for that information to be included in standard academic curricula? What is the threshold, and why has it apparently not been reached here? Put your answer in the comments. Here is where we have to think carefully and soberly, because this is not a small oversight. 3 Arab scholars in 3 major historical texts, all academically translated and available in university libraries, all documenting Hebrew communities in West Africa, and yet this information does not appear in standard high school history curricula in the United States. It does not appear in most university African history survey courses. It does not feature prominently in mainstream documentaries about either Jewish history or African history. That is not an accident of neglect. That is a structural pattern, and it deserves to be examined as such. The dominant narrative of Israelite history, as it has been constructed and institutionalized over the past 2 centuries, places the origin and continuity of the Hebrew people primarily in the Middle East and, following the diaspora, in Europe. The Ashkenazi Jewish communities of Eastern Europe became, in the Western academic and political framework, the primary inheritors and representatives of that identity. The State of Israel was established in 1948 on the basis of that lineage claim, and the entire political and legal architecture of that state, including its law of return, its citizenship frameworks, and its national identity discourse, rests on a specific genealogical and historical argument about who the true descendants of the ancient Hebrews are. Now, introduce into that framework 3 Arab scholars from the medieval period documenting that Hebrew tribes were living in West Africa, and then connect that to the fact that tens of millions of West Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic between the late 1400s and the mid-1800s. That combination does not fit comfortably into the dominant historical narrative. It raises questions that the existing institutional frameworks are not designed to answer. And things that do not fit the dominant narrative do not tend to appear in the textbooks that the dominant narrative produces. I want to be precise here, because precision matters. I am not describing a secret, coordinated conspiracy of individuals sitting in a room deciding to suppress a document. What I am describing is something more structural and more systemic, the way that institutional knowledge systems reproduce themselves by including what reinforces existing frameworks and marginalizing what challenges them. Al-Muqaddimah has been translated into English. Franz Rosenzohl produced a major 3-volume English translation published by Princeton University Press in 1958. It is available in university libraries across this country. Scholars know it exists, but the specific passages about Hebrew communities in West Africa are not highlighted, not integrated into African history courses, and not discussed in mainstream conversations about Israelite dispersal or Black Hebrew identity. And there's an additional dimension to this worth noting. In various years since the 2000s, the Israeli government's legal frameworks around the law of return and genetic verification for immigration eligibility have been contentious, specifically when African-descended Jewish communities are involved, including the Ethiopian Beta Israel community, whose recognition has been a prolonged and politically complicated process. If the Arab historical record documenting Hebrew communities in West Africa were widely taught and publicly integrated into mainstream historical understanding, the implications for those legal and political frameworks would be significant. That is not a small thing.
And I think the silence around al-Bagri, Ibn Khaldun, and al-Makrizi reflects, in part, the weight of what they would mean if they entered broad public consciousness. So here is my question to you. Do you think the exclusion of this information from standard history education is intentional, structural, or a combination of both? I genuinely want to hear your perspective in the comments.
Now I want to bring everything together, because each piece of this, taken alone, is interesting. But when you lay out the full timeline in sequence, the entire picture snaps into focus with a clarity that is very difficult to argue against. Ibn Khaldun writes Al-Muqaddimah in 1377 and documents Hebrew tribal communities living in West Africa. He names the region, describes the practices, connects them to the Banu Israel lineage. He is not speculating or mythologizing. He is compiling from verified sources across the Arabic-speaking scholarly world. At that moment, in 1377, the population he is describing is alive, living, present in West Africa, maintaining their identity, their covenant practices, their communal traditions, across hundreds of years and thousands of miles from their ancestral Middle Eastern homeland. They have survived, they have persisted, they are there. 115 years later, in 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail westward from the Iberian Peninsula. Now, you may already know about 1492 and the triple event of that year from our previous video: the expulsion of the Moors from Granada, the expulsion of Jewish communities from Spain, and Columbus departing with cartographic knowledge that the Portuguese and Moorish geographic tradition had developed through decades of Atlantic and West African coastal exploration. We are not going to re-explain all of that here because we covered it in detail already. What I want you to focus on is the geographic knowledge that existed at that moment. The Portuguese had been trading along the West African coast since the mid-1400s. Their cartographers and navigators had produced detailed records of West African populations. The knowledge of who lived where in West Africa was not a mystery in 1492. It was documented, it was mapped. It was, in certain strategic circles, commercially and politically valuable. And the same coastal regions where Ibn Khaldun placed Hebrew tribal communities in 1377, the Senegambia region, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, the Congo River Basin, these are precisely the geographic coordinates of the transatlantic slave trade. Between approximately 1500 and 1800, an estimated 12 to 15 million people were forcibly removed from those regions and transported across the Atlantic Ocean on slave ships. The number who were originally captured before the deaths during transport was significantly higher. Within 100 years of Ibn Khaldun documenting those communities, the removal had begun. Within 200 years, the population that had maintained its Hebrew identity across more than 1,000 years of West African history was being systematically extracted from that land.
Here I want to reference just briefly what we covered in a previous video, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 68. The verse that describes a people who will be taken back to Egypt in ships into a new form of bondage carried across the sea. We analyzed that passage in depth before, and we are not going to repeat that full examination here. But I want you to hold that scripture in mind as you consider this timeline, because the connection is not subtle. Ibn Khaldun, 1377, Hebrew communities documented and living in West Africa. Portuguese coastal mapping, mid-1400s, West African populations recorded for commercial purposes. 1492, the geopolitical reshuffling of Iberian power, African geographic knowledge, and Atlantic navigation. Late 1400s through early 1500s, the transatlantic slave trade begins to scale systematically. 1619, the first documented arrival of enslaved Africans in English North America at Point Comfort, Virginia. 1865, legal abolition of chattel slavery in the United States.
That is a roughly 400-year window of forced removal. And at the beginning of that window, in 1377, Ibn Khaldun told us exactly who was living in that part of Africa. I want you to sit with that timeline seriously, not as conspiracy theory, not as mythology, as a sequence of documented historical events, each traceable to specific sources, specific scholars, and specific years. Al-Bagri, 1068, Ibn Khaldun, 1377, al-Makrizi, early 1400s, Portuguese records, mid-1400s, the transatlantic slave trade, late 1400s onward, Deuteronomy 28:68. At what point does a coincidence become a pattern? At what point does a pattern become evidence? And at what point does evidence become history that we are obligated to teach, to study, and to reckon with honestly? Let me bring this home. Ibn Khaldun was not a black man fighting for recognition. He was not an activist with a platform to build or an identity to defend. He was an Arab-Muslim intellectual at the absolute peak of medieval scholarly achievement, writing in one of the most respected traditions of historical documentation that the world has ever produced. He wrote in 1377 that Hebrew tribal communities were present and living in West Africa. He was not the only one. Al-Bagri documented it in 1068. Al-Makrizi documented it in the early 1400s. 3 independent Arab scholars across 4 centuries, all pointing to the same geographic reality. And then, within roughly 100 to 150 years of those final documents, the slave trade began systematically removing those populations from that land and scattering them across the Americas, the Caribbean, and the entire Atlantic world. Columbus sailed in 1492. The slave trade followed almost immediately, and the people Ibn Khaldun described in 1377, who had maintained their identity, their covenant practices, their communal memory for over 1,000 years in West Africa, are gone from those records after that. Not because they converted voluntarily, not because they migrated by choice, not because they dissolved naturally into surrounding populations. They were put on ships. And one of the oldest scriptural texts in human history described that exact pattern in detail, thousands of years before it happened. I am not here to tell you what to believe. I am not here to make theological arguments or to tell you who you are or are not. What I am here to do is show you the documents, name the scholars, give you the years, and lay out the timeline. And then let you decide what it means. Because you are fully capable of reading history for yourself. You are capable of evaluating evidence. You are capable of asking the questions that your educators never asked on your behalf. Ibn Khaldun wrote it in 1377, 600 years before this video, 600 years before this debate, 600 years before anyone on the internet was discussing Black Hebrew identity or African history, where the slave trade has prophetic fulfillment. He wrote it. And now you know. If this video opened something up for you, if it gave you a piece of historical evidence you did not have before, I want you to do one thing right now. Comment 1377 below. Just the number, 1377. Because when you comment 1377, you are saying that you know. You know that an Arab-Muslim scholar documented the Hebrew tribes in West Africa 600 years ago. You know that the timeline connects. You know that the silence around these documents is not accidental. Drop 1377 in the comments right now. And if you want to go deeper into the Portuguese records, the DNA research, the scriptural connections, and the full historical case, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on, because this series is just getting started. The truth is not hidden. It is documented. It is translated. It is sitting in university libraries waiting for you to find it. Ibn Khaldun wrote it in 1377, and now it is time for the world to read it.